Well, good morning, and thank you all for registering for the webinar. This is the CCUS Dialogues Before the Roadshow, hosted by the United States Energy Association's Consensus Program. I'm Michelle Littlefield, Program Coordinator with the USEA in their Consensus Program on building consensus on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and clean coal technologies, a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, Fossil Energy. The program has been around since about 2008. And our mission is to educate the public, policymakers, industry, and stakeholders on CCUS and clean coal technologies by hosting webinars such as this one, along with a series of monthly educational briefings, conference workshops, technical reports, and we release monthly news clips of CCUS and clean coal related updates. If you would like to join our mailing list, and if you have not done so already, feel free to send me an email to the address at the bottom of your screen, and we will add you to our subscribers. Our program today will focus on the ever-changing role of CCUS with future projections and expert insight with our moderator, Mr. Mike Moore, Director at USEA, and our guests, Mr. Charles McConnell, Executive Director for Carbon Management at the University of Houston, Mr. Nigel Genevieve, Global Head of Carbon Management at Gaffney & Klein, and Mr. Fred Eames, Partner at Hunton Andrews Kurth. In the last 20 minutes of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. If you have a question you would like to ask, please submit your questions in the Q&A chat box. And thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I hand it over to Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Michelle, and to Chuck and Nigel and Fred for being able to take the time today. We're all enjoying our stay-at-home time up here in Washington and Houston and elsewhere. I'm the program director at one of the program directors at USEA and driving the carbon capture and utilization roadshows. And since the pandemic, we had to roll dates back. We're resetting the remaining programs to do. So we thought it'd be a good idea to do the carbon capture utilization roadshow dialogues, as some of the key speakers that are part of the program get a chance to talk and update. There's been a lot of changes in the market since we last convened in January. I don't have to go through most of it. We're all watching the news 24 hours a day, it seems. But the world still turns. The sun's coming up. We'll need electricity and power and everything that goes with it. So there's going to be a role for low carbon programs and processes. What I'll do, I'm going to have Chuck start off and give us his insights to the world as he sees it down there in Houston in his program, and then we'll roll over to Nigel. And when Nigel finishes up, we'll go off to Fred. And then when Fred is done, then we'll move into the Q&A session. With that, Chuck, I'm going to have you start off. And I don't know, on the website, where people linked in to find the program, there's a full bio on each one of our speakers, our experts here, and I would highly recommend you take the time to read it. There's a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge sitting in these three gentlemen. I've had the pleasure actually of knowing and working with all three of them for at least 15 years now. So a lot of good ground there and those backgrounds. And Chuck, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, Mike, I appreciate it. Of course, I'll be the one speaker that doesn't have any overheads, because that's kind of the way I'd like to be able to engage everyone. I think there's a couple of things that are really important right now for all of the folks that are attending this webinar. Some of you, maybe for early parts in your career, getting involved with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I think anybody that knows me would also know how heartwarming it is that this is CCUS and not simply CCS. That's a long road traveled, but we are here to a point now where I think generally in the marketplace, utilization is recognized as incredibly important, probably now more than ever, in terms of getting this technology out into the marketplace. At a high level, it's clear from studies all over the world that for us to achieve any of the climate targets that are out there, CCUS needs to be broadly commercially deployed. That was the mantra of the National Petroleum Council study, and we'll probably speak about that in more detail later, but fundamentally looking at it contributing anywhere between 10 and 15% of the overall necessary impacts to emissions reduction for us to meet climate targets going forward. Utilization has a broad part to play here in terms of creating economic value. And whether it's enhanced oil recovery, and we all know the price per barrel is low right now, but we also know what cycles are like. And the fact that enhanced oil recovery, but utilization in many other ways in terms of chemicals production, utilization in different industries, et cetera. And looking at carbon dioxide is not simply a waste to be put away, but potentially an accretive part of the value chain. That's going to be critical for us going forward for this broad deployment. But Mike, I think the other thing that we really, I hope, can spend some time on today is talking about how do we get going. I'm sure that many of you on this call today have been to, I don't know how many conferences where we've talked about how important it is, and it is. But what's really important now is to be able to find those places where deployment can occur. The early investments, the places where we're no longer doing fundamental scientific research, but what we're doing is putting commercial projects in play that are going to be living and breathing for the next 20 to 30 years, making a contribution to the industry. I believe there's a strong need for us to focus on areas where it can be done most cost effectively, where we can deploy the technology, get the value, and see emissions reductions based upon locations where infrastructure, industries, the concentration of sources and sinks are all available to us, and not have it be a huge lift for infrastructure. And I think that speaks to the opportunities that would exist in a place like the US Gulf Coast, where we have all those industries, all of those sources of CO2. We also have sinks with the geology, both on and offshore. And we have concentrations or hubs where this kind of commercial development can occur. And by doing that and focusing on places where we can get early wins, we can not only deploy the technology and begin to get the commercial value, but we can also add in all of the fundamental additional work that's still required in terms of scientific development. We still need to look into advanced research in terms of maximizing the amount of CO2 that can go into a geologic formation, maximizing the amount of capture technology value that can be created. And so continuing to drive the cost of carbon capture down. And this isn't just about the US Gulf Coast. It's about the United States providing a place where in the world it can happen, it can come from and be released from a place like that, and to go globally to actually impact all of the other places around the world where CCUS will be so important. So it's about being able to do it fast here in our country, move it forward and have it be a cooperative effort, and to ultimately view this as a global opportunity for us to make a big impact.
Helps to get rid of the mute button. Thank you, Chuck, very much for that. Nigel has devideoized. So what we'll do as he gets reconnected, I'll turn this over to Fred. Fred's a partner at Hunton, Andrews and Kirk, and time in this space, a lot of time on the Hill, policy and regulatory affairs are right up his alley, and has had a number of successes in the work that he's done in this area. And we've had the pleasure of working together. And Fred, I'm going to turn this over to you now, and I'll go track down Nigel.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. Hopefully my mic is on, and I see Michelle has my slides there, so thanks very much. I titled this CCUS Beyond 2020. Just got a few slides here, but titled this CCUS Beyond 2020 because we're really at an interesting point right now for a lot of economic activity, including industrial activity that creates carbon dioxide, and therefore it's an interesting time for CCUS. So Michelle, next slide, please. Will the virus kill CCUS? No. Okay. You know, we've all been looking out and seeing what's happening in the economy. I've got my slides here that I've made some notes on. You know, in the last 6 weeks, we've lost about 30 million jobs in the United States. The Fed's predicting that unemployment could go to 20% and that GDP could shrink this quarter 30% year over year. In other words, compared to last year. Oil futures a couple weeks ago went into severe negative territory, and people are suggesting it might be worse for this month's futures contracts. So some production is going to have to be shut in, and that might get people thinking, okay, we've spent a lot of time emphasizing the U in CCUS, and the main U is enhanced oil recovery. And by the way, Chuck is really the one that put the U in CCUS, and I don't want to disagree with anything that he said, because I agree with Chuck that utilization is really important. But in this current environment that we're in, we may have people looking at other options rather than enhanced oil recovery. If you've got the option for enhanced oil recovery or pure geological storage right now might be looked at as a little bit more attractive than it was a couple months ago. There are still very compelling imperatives and incentives for people to do carbon capture, utilization, and storage. First of all, climate action has strong public support. Okay, 2/3 of the adults in the United States think the federal government is doing too little to address climate change right now. That's according to a Pew study from the end of last year. ESG investing is very much on the rise. The percentage of investors that are applying ESG to at least a quarter of their portfolios went from a little less than half in 2017 to 3/4 last year. And it's predicted that new funds with ESG mandates are set to double over the next 3 years. Corporate climate pledges are definitely increasing. Just at the COP25 in December, there were 177 companies representing almost $3 trillion in market capitalization that signed climate pledges. So it's all of these issues are very significant. And then here in the United States, we've got the 45Q tax credit that is in place, and we're awaiting some additional regulatory information to clarify parts of that credit, but that is very much driving interest in CCUS. So next slide, please. All right, so if we're looking at EOR, enhanced oil recovery, versus, we'll call it dedicated storage. Let's look at the positives and the challenges for each one. The positives for EOR, of course, are that it's a very well understood risk profile. There's been long industry experience with the regulators, long experience of the regulators with the program and with the regulatory structure. Everybody kind of knows what they're getting in enhanced oil recovery. And you've got fewer landowners to deal with than you might with dedicated storage, where the lateral extent of the CO2 spread, as a general matter, can be expected to be much greater. But the challenges are, of course, there's economic turmoil in the oil industry right now, and we don't know exactly how long that's going to persist, but there's a great oversupply in the market right now that'll persist for some while. And some production is going to have to be shut in. Other new production will have to be delayed. There's a lower credit under Section 45Q than there is for dedicated storage. Now, it's intended to equalize based on the fact that, you're likely to be paid from the oil sector for the CO2 supply. But there is a lower credit, and some people have said, well, maybe I just prefer to get it all from through the tax credit rather than part through the market. And there's some uncertainty on 45Q qualification under EOR, which hopefully will be clarified here soon by the IRS and the Treasury Department. That's the secure geological storage issue. The positives for dedicated storage are that you've got lower project interrelationships risk. Okay, this is something that I think has not maybe been highlighted quite enough over the course of discussions on CCUS in the past 10 years or so. A CCUS project, let's say it's an enhanced oil recovery, has to work for all the parties to that project. Okay, their economics have to work out for everybody. If you're doing pure storage and relying more on the tax credit, you've got fewer project partner risks to deal with. And in the current environment, that may be something that people start looking at more seriously and say, well, I'd rather go toward the dedicated storage right now. There is a higher tax credit. Over time, it's going to get up to $50 a ton instead of $35 for enhanced oil recovery. And the qualification criteria for the credit are clear. Any Class 6 well has to have a monitoring, reporting verification plan. But the challenges are that there's less experience with the geological formations at hand. So there's less certainty about the risks that would be posed. There's a higher regulatory burden, relatively speaking, compared to enhanced oil recovery. There's less regulatory experience. The permitting's been really slow. And you've got a larger project footprint, which means your property rights issues are more intense to deal with. Next slide, please. One thing you would look at if you're looking at dedicated storage is what is the regulatory structure there? You're talking about Class 6 wells under the Underground Injection Control Program rather than Class 2 wells. And frankly, there's been some pretty significant concern about the Class 6 program. The National Petroleum Council came out with its CCUS report to the Secretary of Energy in December of last year. And one of the issues that they focused on was Class 6 reform. There are a lot of issues with Class 6 reform, and frankly, I would say to this group, who are, many of the CCUS supporters in the Washington policy arena and around the country, if dedicated storage is going to be more prevalent in the coming years than we had expected, we're going to need to make a bigger priority of Class 6 reform. And so here are some of the issues that the National Petroleum Council study recommended for potential change. One is that the current structure of the UIC program isn't really based on risk profile as much as it should be. And, what that program tries to do is avoid endangerment of underground sources of drinking water. And the endangerment calculation is really not quite as risk-based under the program as it ought to be. There needs to be more monitoring flexibility under the program. Frankly, it really kind of drives you to drilling monitoring wells when there are other techniques that could provide sufficient monitoring with less expense and less hassle. Remember, all those wells have to be permitted, any sort of a well that you're drilling. The financial responsibility under the program is based on very conservative assumptions. I've read that in some of the cases, the EPA has estimated that the cost of remediation of an underground source of drinking water will be $60 million. Well, a number of years ago, Industrial Economics did a study of the Jewett site down in Texas, where they calculated really the upper bound level of risk at about $30 million for the site. And most of that was driven by H2S, possible contamination there, rather than the CO2 itself. So the assumptions on which financial responsibility requirements are established may be too conservative. The post-injection site care period, as many people who know anything about the program know, is a default of 50 years. That's a very long period, especially compared with some other programs that are out there. That period really ought to be shortened. It's not necessary to have a 50-year period. And I can remember from commenting on the Class 6 program when it was being put together that most people commented that 50 years was much too long. And then I'll tell you what, Mike, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of these other ones quickly, but just one thing to say, is let's move to the next slide, please. One thing to talk about is that the resources for the Class 6 program need to be upped, okay? Right now, we've only got one state that has primacy to operate the program in lieu of the EPA, and that's North Dakota. Wyoming has put in a proposal, and there's a proposed rule out right now to give Wyoming primacy, and Louisiana is in the pre-application phase. But if the Class 6 program is going to be used widely, more states are going to need to take over this program, and the EPA is going to need to more quickly process those applications for the states to take over the program. So with that, I'll just cut it right there, and of course, we'll be available with everybody else for questions.
All right, well, Fred, thank you very much for that. And just as a heads up, there are some questions starting to show up for the Q&A part of this as we get ready to move forward. I'd like to bring Nigel Genvy on the table. And Nigel, thank you for taking the time today to be part of this with us. And thank you for being part of the Roadshow efforts we've been underway with as well. Nigel's down in Houston, and he's the global head of carbon management for Gaffney Klein, which is part of the Baker Hughes complex. And I'll let you run with what you'd like to talk about, Nigel, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Great to be here today. Also had the pleasure participating in the first of the Roadshow events back in January in Washington, D.C. Thanks for the opportunity then to take people through the National Petroleum Council study that both Chuck and also Fred have mentioned. But what I want to do today is take you through a few slides around the perspectives here in Houston, particularly important for Houston, being the energy capital of the world, center to a lot of oil and gas, and of course the issues that we're facing now. Of course, we're dealing with two black swan events, being coronavirus and also the oil price crash. But of course, really those events have occurred in the short term relative to an existing longer term challenge, and the other dilemma or dual challenge really the world faces, rather than the coronavirus health and economic impacts. Of course, we've got climate and energy dual challenge. That's basically, of course, where carbon capture, use and storage has its role to tackle. So thanks for bringing up the slides. If we can just go on to the next slide, and I'll cover really what the response has been. The response on the left from companies, and the response really from and driver from the financial institutions. So a few headlines over on the right. I won't dwell on these, but what I want you to kind of walk away with is there is action going on within the oil and gas companies to create new visions of their future. That includes still oil and gas production, but producing it in a different way. And CCUS plays a part in that. But also, in order to get to scope 3 emissions, so that's the end use of oil and gas, CCUS is a critical strategic technology in order to achieve all of really those commitments that the companies are making. And they're making those despite the issues we have, the significant issues, those two black swan events that we have today of coronavirus and the oil price crash. So we've had last year Repsol and then Eni have their net zero target ambitions by 2050. Equinor very started this year, really before coronavirus had really sort of had a major impact within the industry and global economics and health. Equinor came out with their net zero commitment. But certainly during coronavirus, we've still had some major oil and gas companies, international companies, come up with their net zero targets. So BP, that happened on the 20th of February. Shell on the 16th of April. And yesterday, I couldn't get it in the slide, of course, because it's still happening every day. Total came out with their net zero ambition. Now, most of these are addressing not just scope 1, scope 2, that's their operated emissions and the indirect emissions associated with the supply of oil and gas, but they're also addressing the end use of their oil and gas with their customers. So if we could just go on to the next slide. Thanks. And so they've been investing for a long time. I've got my background thanks to some of those oil and gas company investments. I've been working in CCUS since 2004, both in project development, in operation, and also the world's first project that's gone through a closure plan. So I've had that practical experience from working for some of those major oil and gas companies over the last couple of decades. They've been at this. This is not a new thing. And of course, the oil and gas industry, has been playing its role since 1972, really developing CCUS here in the US, associated with gas processing and fertilizer production, capturing those CO2 emissions, and then using it for enhanced oil recovery. The prior to the climate agenda being the commercial way, as Chuck has taken us through, the U in CCUS. And now as we, of course, move on and incorporate the climate agenda into these plans, there's going to be more capture from different sources, different industries, and also new ways to use the CO2 and large-scale geological storage as well. The oil and gas companies you can see on this chart from the IEA, they're the ones that have really been focusing on CCUS. Oil and gas companies need CCUS, but CCUS also needs oil and gas. It needs their capability, their project experience of delivering large-scale, complex projects, and also, of course, their balance sheets. So next slide, please. Okay, and the last slide, as I said, half of all CCUS today is performed within oil and gas operations, reducing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So More is possible. The chart over on the right, top right, really shows a IEA analysis around what is possible within oil and gas value chains in their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions from gas processing, combined heat and power, hydrogen production, and FCC. A lot of these sources we looked at in the NPC study to determine, a lot of the recommendations in our economic analysis. So you can see this, approximately a third of all of the potential for CCUS deployment in oil and gas can be achieved at a cost of less than $50 a ton in terms of CO2 price. Now, the bottom chart shows the strategic value of CCUS. So this uses IPCC, economic and climate models, and looks at the demand for oil and natural gas with and without CCUS, and the shaded areas, of course, is the difference. The darker color shows for each of the oil and natural gas shows what would happen within climate models with oil and gas demand with CCUS. So you'll see a continued increase in natural gas demand and a continued increase, in fact, for oil demand, of course, for a period of time until alternative transport technologies really come into to being economic. But of course, the difference without CCUS is pronounced. The volumes are huge, 200 billion barrels of oil out to 2050, and 1,300 TCF of natural gas really is what CCUS enables the oil and gas industry, but also the world to have affordable energy supply, not just for power and electricity, but also for other materials, a lot of which have gone into the coronavirus response effort in plastics, but also, of course, get into to transportation as well. So it's really important. CCUS underpins the future. It's not just an oil and gas technology, but oil and gas is embracing it, and it is getting on with incorporating it into their planning activities. I'll hand it back to Mike.
All right, Nigel, thank you very much and very informative. There are a series of questions coming in, and we'll get to those here in a couple of minutes. One of the things I want to throw out on the table is, I'll aim this at Chuck. You've been in your background, you did commercial sales for a big industrial global gas company, CO2 being one of the gases, and you also were involved with gasification, and you were involved with the early work in Texas. You were at Patel Labs, you were at the DOE, now you're in academia. You've gotten to see the full spectrum of the play. What is it going to take? What are the things that are going to take for up and increasing the commercialization of CCUS? I'll start with you on that one. You kind of hit some pieces in buckets. That's a big question everybody keeps asking. I'll throw that one out at you to start with.
Well, I think the most compelling part of the discussions that both Fred and Nigel threw out was that this is being driven by companies and customers. And that's a whole different approach than governmental regulations and using a stick, but really more along the lines of clients and customers around the world and markets demanding lower carbon intensity products. Now, the companies that are going to pay attention to that are the ones that will be on the chart that Nigel showed. Other companies, of course, developing their strategies as well. But to answer your question, I think the translation of this technology from institutional research and the efforts that have gone into it up to now are really now at a stage where it is a commercially demonstrated opportunity. Companies around the world now have declared themselves to be committed to this net zero effort over time. And so I believe that the places around the world that are the most opportunistic places for investment to be made, infrastructure's in place, the conditions are in place for sources and sinks, the ability to connect this is there. And I think these companies that have made these declarations, in my mind, it's kind of like showtime, Mike. It's the moment where the talk has to translate to the walk. And once it does, there's a tremendous amount of support, governmentally, policy, state incentives, all those things to make it work. And there are some pockets of states around our country where those kinds of existential efforts that states make to continue to promote the work and the effort and the economies that they have and they want to continue to promote. I think the oil and gas community may be in a similar mode these days. They weren't before. They were looking at it, but now they've really come to this moment where they've declared the opportunities exist. The fertile fields have been identified. And I think really it's about now following that customer drive, following that customer demand. And it's going to be incredibly important to do it in a cost-effective manner, which I think is the other thing that CCUS brings, is it brings an opportunity to take existing resources that are in the ground, bring them to fruition. But it also says, given the crisis that we've come through, there's probably now no more opportune time for a carbon tax. We've talked about it for the last 10 years in this country, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's a good or a bad thing, but at the end of the day, a carbon tax would go a long way toward replenishing a lot of what's gone out the door here during the stimulus. And I have a belief that that will also be a significant policy driver to move this technology forward, because it'll be part of that solution.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So some great points, and I think one observation indeed, people will have undoubtedly is most of those companies that I had in oil and gas that are making moves and net zero commitments and are talking about, as Chuck said, talking about CCUS and its role. Of course, the reality is all of the action is here in the United States. Historically, we have the oil and gas companies here have done the most, are doing the most already. Oxy, Exxon, Chevron, they have the most significant portfolios of CCUS actual deployment today. So if we indeed pull back perhaps from some of the commitments that are being made to the actual activities, the capability, what's been deployed today, actually it is here in the US. The narrative is definitely different, but it's happening here. And indeed, with the NPC study, the foundations around some of the tax credits for 45Q, and indeed some other tax credits around 48A and B, and other financial mechanisms and policies that can lower the cost of capital. The US really is the leader, as well as with some of the regulatory aspects that are in play and frameworks that are there that Fred took us through. And I'm sure we will see the attention of those European companies coming to rest here in the US to execute projects.
I think something to throw out there to keep in mind is that CCUS is not relegated to the power industry. It is applicable to cement, steel manufacturing processes, petrochemical manufacturing, in the refining process. There's a whole range of areas that CCUS has an application in. its first footing was aimed at the power generation from coal, but is now expanded to a far broader range of participants because it can be done at scale. There are a lot of ways to reduce a carbon footprint, but these industrial processes have big footprints that need big scale offsets or processes to change. Plastics could be one of them as an example. We're taking plastics and run them into an ideal setting in a gasification process where you convert those hydrocarbon chains back into something basic as a feedstock or a fuel for something else, and the plastics doesn't come back into the marketplace. Wide range of examples. Fred, did you want to add anything to the commercial piece of that?
No, not on that. Fine.
Where you're working and sitting from the hillside of things, it's a very awkward moment in time with a House sitting outside of Congress and the Senate in. So a lot of interesting stuff's going to get thrown around. There's a lot of questions flying around if there's going to be things that could pop up in bills that are being floated now, the new stimulus bills. It's extensions, 45Q tax credits might be in there. If there's going to be anything in the infrastructure talks, the energy bill that didn't get off the deck was what was laid out by the Senate. Will it show up in an infrastructure bill? Any of those kind of things can we expect? And then we get done with that. We do have a handful of questions. I'd like to get to some of our audience that's throwing some questions at us.
Sure. So with respect to the next COVID bill, whatever you want to call it, a stimulus bill, it might be an infrastructure bill. The House, of course, is working on a package right now, which I understand is being held fairly closely at the leadership level. But we can expect that that's going to be a fairly broad-ranging bill, and that may get into some energy provisions. The Senate has been resisting going beyond getting into policy issues that are beyond the immediate emergency. There have been a lot of people out there working to get energy issues into a COVID bill. There's been a lot of talk, specifically with respect to CCUS. People have talked about, well, if there was an extension of the Section 45 renewable tax credit, could you use the Section 45Q and try to get an extension of 45Q, the under construction date in 45Q, as a trade with Section 45? My response to that would be, I don't think Section 45Q needs a trade. Section 45Q is broadly supported across both sides of the aisle and really ought to stand on its own. The industry has had to wait for a while to get clarification on a number of the issues under Section 45Q, and that has delayed things. And we've talked here today about the length of time it takes under Class 6, for example, to get permitting. So I do think a Section 45Q, an extension of the under construction date, is warranted. I don't think it's something that ought to be a trade necessarily, but I would hope that Congress would address that if they do energy in one of these upcoming bills.
Fred, one of the things that as you do the work that you do, a real quick one, the issue of water scarcity when it comes to CCUS. It seems that there might be some questions about how that might look in the future and how CCUS may apply to part of that.
Yes, there was a report that just came out within the last day or two, specifically on water issues. Somebody looked globally at CCUS and said, there's a lot of areas in the world that have water restrictions, and if you deploy CCUS, you're going to need to use power in order to run the capture equipment, and that's going to, let's say you're talking about the power sector. You're then going to be able to put less power on the grid because you need it for the capture equipment. Does that somehow pose a water issue because you've got constrained water use there and you're taking away water use from the public? Well, frankly, the area in the United States where water use is most restricted is, of course, the arid West. And we've got appropriative rights for water out in the West. Things are determined by agreements between the states and then allocations within the states. So if somebody has a new use of water, that's an issue that's going to have to be addressed anyway. So I don't really necessarily see that as a new issue here in the United States. It's good that the authors looked at this because it's an important issue, but I don't think it's really a new issue. The other thing I noticed in some commentary on that study that John Thompson from the Clean Air Task Force had commented that, you know, that it doesn't necessarily take into account that at some facilities, carbon capture would have less water use. And I would point out that Southern Company's trig technology that they developed, the facility they were working on was going to have zero freshwater use. They were actually going to use much of the water that was in the coal itself, plus some gray water, local gray water, to be able to operate that plant. So it can be done with a low or no freshwater use profile.
Well, there's there's two. I'd say we have two shifting off that encumber some of the. Still encompass the interest in a couple of the questions. So we have two events that are significant to CCUS that have unfolded over the last few weeks, and one of them is negative $40 crude oil, which sent incredible strong ripples. There's in fact reverberating through the market space on the close out of the May futures contract. There's going to be a lot of work, I think, that's been initiated out of Congress to try to understand what happened to drive a market to a negative 40 number. And the other one is 45Q, and the recent news that there was questions on a number of the credits that had been filed under the old program. And it's created some concerns and some consternation. Is this program monitored and managed well? Well, those under the older program started for a lot of people that may not have been in the space after the last stimulus event in 2008. And in fact, there was a handful of industry people and NGOs that actually crafted the language for the first 45Qs. Their size and scope and requirements actually asked for more improvements, which we got in the expanded version of the 45Q we're working now. So I'm not sure where all that goes in today. I'm not an attorney, but there's certainly going to be some questions and people looking around. And I don't know if any of you three want to weigh in on that or not. Not being a party to any of it myself, but understanding why they were created, who got involved in the early process of creating the 45Q, and what value proposition in good settings 45Q can do to stimulate this. Very supportive of making sure we make these things work right. But I don't know if any one of you three want to touch that or not. I'll put that on the table. It is a question. It is coming up, I think, several times now in the group of participants' questions that are on our deck.
I'll take it first.
Yeah,
go ahead,
sorry.
Nigel.
Well, I was just going to start off with Fred. Then you definitely come in with the legal aspects, please. But I was going to start off at least with, the NPC's viewpoint of 45Q, the enhanced 45Q tax credit, and how that looks in terms of what will it create. So the NPC study had 3 phases of CCUS deployment to get to scale. Scale ultimately, to the NPC definition, was about 0.5 gigaton of CO2 emissions reductions across various industries in the United States. So scale that can be achieved. This is technology that is deployed today, commercially available and can be scaled. So very important to note of how much scale can be achieved in a relatively short space of time. The first phase, the activation phase, was effectively around getting clarifying clarities to 45Q, with also some other agency action. And those clarifications just require agencies, of course, to provide those clarities. So to really unlock the ability for the financial aspects of 45Q to really allow its monetization and underpin project investments. The analysis that we did suggested that 45Q would achieve about 60 million tons per annum cumulative total CCUS deployment here in the US. Where we are today is 25 million tons, 30 million tons per annum. So it would double existing deployment of CCUS here in the US. It would require investment of about $50 billion to achieve that. Could be achieved within 5 to 7 years quickly. Would develop 10,000 annual jobs, annual new created jobs associated with those clarifications. And really, yeah, an investment in infrastructure, you know, of about $2 billion. So it has a lot of value for the economy, providing those clarifications, getting those in place, and therefore, indeed, what Fred was saying earlier on around 45Q having bipartisan support, it's there and that needs to come through, and that can help any stimulus and recovery from coronavirus.
You know, look, just to jump in real quick, Nigel, if I recall, that also recommended for that to occur something like $100 or $110 a ton credit for the CO2 that would be stored. Do I have that right?
So that was the third phase of at-scale deployment in order to achieve the 0.5 gigaton. You know, and really 0.5 gigaton, it could be a lot more because there's so much emissions at that type of level. With today's technologies, let's make sure people understand that as well. That doesn't include any technology cost reduction. But if there is incentive and support and a market of that level of between $90 and $110 per ton around about, we could get to really at least 0.5 gigaton of CO2 emissions reductions. And that was basically therefore at scale deployment, addressing at least 10% really of the US's annual greenhouse gas reductions with this one technology.
And I guess the point from that, Nigel, is on an average at $110 a ton, that's not where we are today. We're at $50 a ton. And so pointing all the more reason why we need to go to advantageous areas, put a stick in the ground, and begin to actually move it forward. And I've been aware of several of the clusters that have been looked at, but certainly the U.S. Gulf Coast having probably the biggest sense of attributes that could be gained initially to move this forward. Would you agree?
I would say there's definitely a lot of the process emissions, which are the lower cost emissions to capture, and indeed the geological storage capacity here in the Gulf Coast definitely, are some of those natural attributes that would tend to make companies look at 45Q is how it exists today and its level of incentive. There are, of course, other really fantastic projects elsewhere up in Wyoming, up in the Midwest, in the Rockies. So those regions too, I think, do have something to say around deploying 45Q cost effectively. But certainly here in the Gulf Coast, I think some of the plans, around creating a hub and also, an innovation center here makes so much sense. There's so much capability to draw on that would really, set us up well for the future. So this can be done today. It's commercially viable in several areas. And further investment in technology really underpins, can underpin massive additional reductions in CO2 emissions.
Yeah, and Mike, I'd add to that, I had made the point earlier that because of the turmoil in the oil sector right now, some people may start looking more seriously at dedicated storage projects. You're still going to be working with the oil companies. They're the ones that have expertise. They're the ones that have the pipelines and the infrastructure. They have land rights. So, it may be that they take the CO2 to a place where they've got the land rights and the formation is underneath the oil field or stacked somehow. But let me go back to the question that you have posed, Mike. I think part of it got to this issue of the IRS Inspector General report that came out recently in response to Senator Menendez's questions on the claiming of the Section 45Q credit. First, I was surprised to see that there were actually thousands of people that have claimed the credit so far. Only a few large ones, of course, but thousands have claimed the credit. We know, anybody who works in this field knows, there are only a few monitoring, reporting, and verification plans that have been approved by the EPA. And so if that's a requirement to obtain the credit, then there would be a lot of people that have not done that. But my question would be, is it more likely that those people set out to not abide by what the requirements were, or is it more likely, and put themselves at some risk in doing so, or is it more likely that the rules weren't clear to begin with? Okay, we know we've been working on trying to clarify those rules for quite some time, so I would submit to you that it very clearly is the latter. So that's what's at issue here, and hopefully that's the clarification that we will get out of the IRS and Treasury very soon.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Fred. I think specifically, I think some of those interpretations historically, of preambles to rules, and the language in there is not actually, some of those requirements aren't actually, the issue is around the clarifications required is some of the wording isn't actually in the rules itself. It's not in it's just in the preambles, etc. And so therefore it's a matter of interpretation rather than a matter of rule and law. So yeah, it's a really interesting point. And indeed, we all have been working in this space, and it's something everybody's been working to try and get clarity on, including the companies, all of the companies involved, even those that have submitted and received EPA approved MRV plans. They've been working on this and trying to resolve it. So, and it still needs to be resolved.
So we're going to be running tight now towards our end time. And there's a lot of good questions that I'm not going to be able to get to. At a high level, one of them was looking for how do you find a copy of the MPC study? I don't know if we have a link to that somewhere. Also, people are asking about the 48A and 48B tax credits. We have questions in there asking about what other states might go for a Class 6 permit outside of what you named. What would the process time be to get a Class 6 primacy in a state, and how many Class 6 wells have been, but there's also a number of the questions around the 45Q and the Inspector General's report and Senator Mendez's request for things there as well. And I think we've covered some of that as well. One last couple of minutes here. Is there anything the three of you would like to add before I turn it over to Michelle and she wraps us up?
Just thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And of course, I've worked with Nigel and Mike and Chuck for many years, and it's really a pleasure to be here and be able to do this. So thank you. And I would say you forced me to dress up in a coat and tie to go to my basement. All right.
These things are going to have a life of their own long after we've moved out of our houses back to our offices. It'll be interesting just to see how many people look at themselves after having done a number of webinars while they are sealed up in their homes over the last 8 weeks, 9 weeks. Anyway, thank you, gentlemen, very, very much for being part of this. We will do another one of these in about 5, 6 weeks, working on the dates. We're going to cycle through some of the other speakers that we use in our CCUS Roadshow deck, and pay attention. Stay tuned on our USEA website for that. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Michelle.
Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you, Mike, and a big thank you to our guests and our viewers. The CCUS Roadshow is still slated to happen either later this year or early next year, so we have that to look forward to. And that's also, of course, depending on the outcomes of the pandemic. In the meantime, as Mike mentioned, we will have another CCUS Dialogues Before the Roadshow, which will happen around the second week of June, around the same time, same format, webinar with a new set of speakers who were also featured at the Roadshow in DC in January. Please look for an announcement in the coming weeks with webinar details. We'll send out an email to our mailing list. If you'd like to join that, please feel free to send an email to myself or Alex. In the meantime, I hope everyone is being safe and healthy, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.